Dr. Thomas Armstrong, welcome to the Power Within You podcast. It's lovely to have you here with me today. How are you
Thank you,
today?
Mom Tom. Very good. Very good. It's
Good.
nice to be here. It's a sunny day in California.
I'll stop it. It's not so sunny here in London, unfortunately. But yeah, I mean, California is one place I want to go because I think the amount of good work being done on the topics that we're discussing today, I
Right.
think is incredible. But I just wanted to kind of start with saying how, and I said this to you also before as well, but how much in awe I am of the work that you've done on neurodiversity and ADHD. I was wondering, if I could start with what kind of piqued your interest. I know you've done your background in psychology, but
Right.
what piqued your interest in neurodiversity, especially?
Well, I was originally a special education teacher,
Mm.
and so I was working with kids with a variety of special needs. And the problem was the environment I was in, the public schools, were not understanding their needs. And they it really bothered me, in fact, that these were kids that were fascinating in so many different ways. I had kids that, you know, started to tell stories, write stories, first day they got in, and then they would almost write novels by the end of the term.
No.
And there were dancers, there were actors. I had a model for a large shopping concern. I had a psychic child. I had that was very interesting. Um, I had a child who had the national U.S. record for in his age group for breaststroking in swimming, and a lot of other kids like that. And yet, all these kids were coming in being labeled as learning disabled or educationally handicapped or behaviorally disordered. We had a different group of labels back then, but they were the same kind of issues, and those kids would receive these labels: ADD, ASD, LD, etc. Were they around today in the schools? So this really bothered me. Why are kids with these gifts being pathologized?
Mm.
And many of them didn't like coming in because this is where all the goofy kids, all the crazy kids, the so-called retards are. And I never had a very good answer to give them. So this got me thinking about the needs of kids who learn differently, who behave differently, who attend differently. And then there's a second thing that was an influence on me, and I think that's my family.
Mm.
I grew up with a father who had clinical depression, and he had several episodes of that, and they were very, very difficult for at least, some of the other family members say, oh, it wasn't so bad. It was really bad. It was
We're
really,
so
really
good at
bad.
avoiding, aren't we? Human beings just avoid stuff.
Yeah, exactly. The denial can really work wonders sometimes, and sometimes not. But so I really had that experience, and then as I became an adult, I had started having those experiences. So that made me very interested in mental health. So it was those two areas, education and psychology, that really brought me into an understanding or an excitement about neurodiversity. Before I got into neurodiversity, I was focused on multiple intelligences, which
Mm.
is Howard Gardner, the Harvard psychologist Howard Gardner's theory that there's not just an IQ intelligence, but there's at least 8 different intelligences, including music intelligence and nature intelligence and intelligence of logic and the intelligence of people skills and so forth. And that to me was a wonderful model because it helped explain the gifts that I had seen kids show. And it helps explain why a person can have a gift and also have a real problem in another area. Even kids who are dyslexic, who have trouble reading, oftentimes are great speakers with good vocabularies. So within the world of words, in one part of it they have difficulty, in another part they excel. So each one of us is kind of a unique snowflake with our own unique combination of things that work well for us, things that are so-so, and things that really we prefer to just put under the table and or under the rug. And so, yeah, these were some of the influences that brought me into that. One day I remember I was cruising the internet and I saw this site, neurodiversity.com,
Mm.
and they had the pictures of Andy Warhol and Glenn Gould, the musician, and Alan Turing, the computer pioneer. And underneath it, their pictures, was the phrase, honoring the varieties of human wiring. And
Mm.
something like thrilling went through my body saying, this is it, this is it. This is the connection. This is the multiple intelligences of people who depart from the quota norm, that depart from the neurotypical. And I thought this is the kind of model we need to talk about individuals that I've been working with all along, who have struggled with various things and yet who have shown, talents, abilities, intelligences. And somehow we got to get this information out to people. To me, this was a real uh, a real potential reform of all of our special education systems.
Mm.
Because special education, and I still feel that it's true, is pretty much still bogged down in old baggage
Yep.
related to brain damage and a lot of negative ways of looking at kids.
Mm.
And I think neurodiversity can be a new focus for special education, so that when kids come in, the first thing that you do isn't try to find out what their disability is and then spend several hours every day focusing on it. But the first thing you're going to do is, what are their gifts? What are their talents? What can they do really well? How can I
Mm.
take what they do really well and help them learn the things that they're having difficulty with? Just a whole different orientation with a different set of assessment tools and a different approach to working, teaching them. And that's partly what I'm pushing now, is trying to get special ed programs to become, current with the latest information. And even the information we have about neuroplasticity, the fact that the
Mm.
brain is still available for new learning, actually into old age, but for the most part into the early 20s, suggests that when we have kids, we've got them for a critical amount of time, and the choices that we make about what we're going to use to help them learn or grow will determine who they're going to be when they become adults. So that's a tremendous responsibility, and the fact that special ed is sort of bogged down with all of these old tools, some of these old assessments, the Illinois test of psycholinguistic abilities, and there was one assessment that we used to give, and I believe it's still around, and it was the WRAT, the
Mhm.
rat. The rat.
It
Have
says
you
it
given
all.
them the rat yet? No, we haven't given them the rat, but we're going to give them the rat next week. It's just ridiculous, So,
Yeah, I think I think you're absolutely right. I think the construct of our education system has not really changed over centuries for some reason.
right.
And I think it's just kind of like, from when I was at school to now, it hasn't, it's better, but like it is getting the kids through like their exams and, the typical subjects and getting them through the door.
Right.
And the teachers being burnt out as well, particularly in the UK, we can see that as well. I'm sure that's happening everywhere. And I think that, you know, having the time to recognize someone's special gifts and abilities, intelligence, is not taken into consideration when kids join the school.
No.
It just isn't. And I think your work, that's why your work is so key, because it helps the education system, people, educators plus parents recognize perhaps what they can do and how they can support their children, which I think is super important, and help them into adulthood as well.
Yes.
Our emotional brain doesn't develop until 25, and
Right.
like you said, you've got time to like really be able to help young people through that process and help them become
Exactly.
stable adults as well.
Yeah, we should be helping kids from a fairly early age, identify their gifts, and then identify careers out there that make use of
Mm,
those gifts, you know,
absolutely. People are so
regardless of,
confused. Kids are so confused about what careers they want to go into.
yeah,
Even without neurodiversity,
yes,
it's tough
exactly.
out
And
there.
now we're finding that people with who are on the spectrum have specific gifts that are needed in the information technology
Hmm.
field. And, I think this has happened in the UK and in America. I think it started with a company up in Denmark that
Mm.
their job was to read computer code that other companies gave them and find bugs, find mistakes and correct them. And it was very boring work for neurotypical people, but for people on the spectrum, who one of their gifts is the ability to cue into small details,
Mm.
and another gift of theirs is the ability to work with systems rather than people. And so a system like a computer program and computer language. So that this particular task marshaled all of their gifts, and three-quarters of their staff, as it turned out, was on the spectrum. They were intentionally hired because they were on the spectrum, which is a totally different view than we've had before. Before it was like hire the handicapped. Why? Well, because it's the moral thing to do. Because it's the legal thing to do. We have to do it. We have quotas. No.
Mm.
Now we've got a whole new approach with neurodiversity. You hire people on the spectrum because they do a better job than anybody else. And
Correct.
that's the kind of revolution, I think, that can take place at the adult level in terms of helping prepare youth for careers and make the transition from school to work. And
Mm.
there are just a lot of implications, very positive implications of neurodiversity at all stages of the lifespan.
Absolutely. I was in tech for 20 years before I became a coach. And, I certainly reckon I worked with lots of developers and coders and certainly recognized that. But it was never, there was, no, we knew that there was something different, but no one really recognized what that difference was and what that skill level was and why it was so special as well. And I think you're right. Things are, hopefully changing now to kind of
Yes,
understand that. Um, so obviously, when your interest came along, you wrote a book called The Myth of the ADD Child, which was published in 1995, and then it got significantly revamped recently to The Myth
right,
of the ADHD Child
correct.
as well. So tell me more about. And obviously, you have many books out there, which I encourage everyone to go and buy and read. This particular book, though, like what you wrote this a while ago, and now we can see the diagnosis of ADHD increasing. So I guess
Hugely.
before we go hugely, yeah. So before we go into the book, like, is there like a particular reason, do you think? Was it always the case that people had ADHD and it wasn't recognized? Or is it now that it's being more recognized and people are kind of sitting up and taking, notice of ADHD?
Well, I got interested in this issue 50 years ago when I was actually I was taking a course in abnormal psychology, and I wanted to take a trip to India. This was close to the Christmas break, and I would miss the test I would need to take. And so the teacher let me write a paper instead. And that was the first paper I wrote about hyperkinetic kids. And my argument was that we label kids too much and we should just look at their individual needs, each child in their own way. And so that really got me thinking right from the start, even before ADHD was a term. And people get kind of shocked a little bit and maybe even a little angry sometimes when they read the title of my book, The Myth of the ADHD Child, because they think I'm saying that there's no ADHD symptoms, that these are just normal, focused, relaxed kids who can, just buckle down and do the work without any problem. I'm not saying that at all because I worked with kids in the, both in Canada in the parochial school system and in the US in the public school system, with kids, all of my classes were with kids that had tremendous difficulty with behavior, with attention, with distractible minds, and some of the kids had conduct disorders and such. And so I know I obviously know that those symptoms exist. What I take issue with is the concept that there is something, a disorder called ADHD, that is causing those symptoms of hyperactivity, impulsivity, and distractibility. Because there are a lot of other things that can cause those same symptoms. And, the book goes through a lot of those. One thing, for example, is research has shown that the brains of kids who are diagnosed with ADHD develop perfectly normally. There's not a defective brain, but they develop 2 to 3 years later than the average individual, than the neurotypical child. Now, if they are maturing later, that means they're showing traits that are associated with younger kids. And of course, if you look at a baby, every baby has ADHD, right? Every baby is totally looking around, and they hear something, and they're just, hyperactive all over the place. It's normal to be ADHD as a baby, and then still as young children to be playful, to be humorous, to be, and I noticed that in my classes. These kids were often like younger children. And so, these younger behaviors get then reinterpreted as signs of ADHD, when in fact they're just really part of their nature and part of their developmental process, which over time will iron itself out. And that's what the research shows, that a certain proportion of kids have been diagnosed with ADHD, but by adulthood it's much smaller, because those kids have matured. Their nervous systems have all been myelinated, and all the different things that need to happen. I had a kid once in my class for special education, and he was a very interesting kid, very intelligent kid. He'd spent time in Hong Kong. I was giving him some nonsense words from one of these ridiculous tests, and one of the nonsense words was Kowloon. And he said, "Oh, yeah, I lived in Kowloon," which is just outside of Hong Kong, or maybe it's part of Hong Kong. Anyway, several years later, I was teaching a course in human development, and he popped up again. And there he was. And it was so interesting, because as a young child, or not a young child, he was about 6th grade, I think, when I was working with him. He was all over the place. Now, as a young adult, he was still a little bit hyperactive. You could tell, but a lot of that had been turned into little mini movements. So he'd settled down. He gained control over those large motor movements. And he was doing more of what most of us do, especially if we're listening to something that's boring. We're tapping our fingers, we're tapping our toes, we're moving our legs around under the desk where no one can see us, and, all that kind of thing. So, if we take a developmental view, it's really inappropriate to label a lot of these kids ADHD. And one other wrinkle is that we're continually asking kids to do things at earlier and earlier ages that we used to have them do, later on. So we're asking a kindergartner to do what we used to ask first graders to do. We're expecting preschool kids to do what kindergartners used to do. Kindergarten is no longer a children's garden, which is the German translation. It's, get out the worksheets and learn how to read. The expectations have changed. So here you've got kids who are normally younger than their years being asked to do things that would be developmentally inappropriate, even if they were at their years, so to speak. And it's like they're caught between a rock and a hard place.
Yeah,
So that's
really.
just one piece of a huge mosaic of issues that are other ways in which the symptoms can come up that don't require the positing of a medical disorder called ADHD. I think that this disorder got out of hand, really. It was started out as a suggestion in 1971 during a speech that a woman gave to the Canadian Association of Psychologists. And it just sort of took off from that point. And I think there were a couple of really big, important moments in their history. One when parents got involved, and then once when the schools began accepting for special education kids with this diagnosis, and then when the drug companies got involved. And I think the drug companies is really the biggest issue right now because
Yeah.
it's it's like greed city, let's get our market share going up and up. And that's in fact what you see. You see the curve. I mean, it went zoom like this during the 2000s, and it's tapered off a little for the psychostimulants, but for
Mm.
the other non-psychostimulants like the norepinephrine reuptake inhibitors like Strattera, it's continuing to go up. And this is like a multi-billion dollar industry that's fueling, if you've got a tool, well, we've got to find people to use it on. And so they have close association with doctors. There's a book on that came out, The Selling of ADHD, I think it was called, about the cozy relationships between doctors and drug companies. And so, this thing has really gone out of hand, and that's all I can say.
Yeah, I think you're the big pharma, right? It's a massive issue with not just ADHD but other disorders as well, and they're pushing the
Exactly.
drugs against with the doctors. Because really, when I'm sort of been listening to you, it feels like it's something which it could be, depending on what the symptoms are, it could be managed without those drugs,
Sure.
possibly.
And
Um, yes, sorry, Thomas.
I'm,
Yes, go
I'm
ahead.
just saying I'm not against the use of
Mm,
drugs. I think that they're another tool in the range of strategies that can be used. I think we go to it too quickly without considering alternatives first. And if you don't have to take the drug, it's definitely better that you don't because it's got uh, side effects, mostly minor side effects, but there are occasional major side effects on the heart, the bones, um, and there's even some methylphenidate-induced psychoses, things like that rarely occur. But it suggests that if you don't have to take it, then don't take it. But you need alternatives, and that's why most of the book, that the myth of the ADHD child, the subtitle is 101 ways to improve your child's behavior and attention span without drugs, labels, or coercion. So I've just got a lot of really great strategies that I think parents and teachers and doctors should consider first, before they consider the drug. And then if those things seem to not be working or working at all, then by all means use the drugs. But maybe you don't have to use as much if you're using some of these alternatives. For
yeah.
example, if kids are out in nature, the research has shown that their symptoms decrease. Well, that makes nature a drug, doesn't it?
Mm,
And if nature's a drug, well, use that drug first.
yeah,
and then
indeed.
if there's still, some cause for concern, then bring in some drugs. Don't start with the drugs and then forget about nature. This is what drives me nuts, in effect,
Mm,
because all I'm asking is for parents to do things that are good for all kids. You know, things like getting together as a family, to play games, to tell stories, getting out in nature together, getting enough sunshine, eating well. These are the things that we've lost as a
mm,
culture. And
mm,
it's like, it seems to me very odd that our culture has lost all these things. And our response, instead of saying, well, we better get those back, our response is, no, there's a drug for that. There's a drug for coping for the fact that we don't have a very good culture, and that just doesn't make any sense. That's bizarre.
yeah, and unfortunately, being the advantages of being in the technology world is amazing, but also the disadvantages of it as well, of being in tech too much, or being on our devices too much. I think it's
That's a
easier
huge issue.
to use it as a pacifier for kids to kind of like, get them distracted and do something else. Whereas, when you're saying, and certainly when I was, you know, very young, like sort of 7, 8 years old, I'd be on my bike outdoors all the time.
Right.
I
Yeah.
wouldn't worry about, I'd be out in the morning, back in the evening for dinner, and
Right. Those were
it's
the
out all
days.
day. Those are the days. And
Yeah.
you don't really see that anymore. And maybe because there's a fearfulness of danger out there as well, and,
That
communities and
has
that sort of stuff.
something to do with it.
Yeah, but I think you're absolutely spot on about, like, it's kind of being able to choose using a more of a holistic approach to treat it and treat
Exactly.
ADHD. Would you call ADHD a disorder or a mental health issue? Or is it just something which is, a way of being, I guess? Like, is there, because people get very confused about neurodiversity, mental health issues, ADHD, that sort of stuff. How can we separate that though? I mean,
Well, I see ADHD as one kind of diversity
right.
within the broad range of neurodiversity. When I do my teaching, I focus on five diversities. I focus on ADHD, dyslexia, ASD,
Mhm.
autism spectrum disorder, intellectual disabilities like Down syndrome and Williams syndrome, and social and emotional disorders like bipolar
Mm,
disorder and schizophrenia. So there are lots of other neurodiversities out there as well, but this takes in a rather large number of kids who are in the world of special education, and then I can talk about how, in the metaphor I like to use is, take a calla lily.
yes.
And, in the medical model, the calla lily has petal deficit disorder because it's just got the one beautiful
Yeah.
petal.
Yeah.
But we don't say that. We
Right.
appreciate the calla lily for what it is, for its beauty,
Mm,
for its uniqueness, for what it adds to the color of our lives. And that's the same approach we ought to take with our kids and with our teens and our adults, is not seeing them in terms of what they're missing, but
mm,
seeing them in terms of who they are. And that
absolutely.
includes, I'm not a Pollyanna. I'm not saying, oh, well, let's just forget that a person with autism has difficulty with people, and let's just focus on their systematizing and their focus on detail. I'm not saying that at all. Obviously, a big part of helping individuals who are on the spectrum is to give them tools and better ways of interacting with others, because that's an inevitable part of being in the world, unless you're going to be a hermit on a mountain somewhere, which most people aren't.
Sounds
Eh,
good.
No, it's
Hide
not my
away.
not my way of a thought of a fun time. But so the approach is to embody an understanding of them in terms of their gifts and their challenges, and to be able to use tools that use their strengths to help them master their difficulties.
Yes,
So,
absolutely.
so for people with Down syndrome, one of the gifts of people with Down syndrome is that they're clever mimics. They're great actors, and they're very humorous in many cases, and very personable, very charming in many cases. Um, I mean, obviously, I'm generalizing, but these are some of the things that people have noticed. So, for a young child, many people with Down syndrome have difficulty with logical thinking, logical mathematical intelligence, to use Howard Gardner's term. So, one example is of this using strengths to help with difficulties is have the child put on a puppet show where they tell the story of a math problem, of a math word problem.
Mm,
And so they're acting it out and they're enjoying that, and they're also having to work out the math inside that. And so, matching, mixing and matching, teaching a child who's been diagnosed. By the way, I want to say something. I
Mm.
don't say the ADHD child or the child with ADHD. I try to say always the child who is diagnosed with
Sure,
ADHD.
sure.
Because when we say the ADHD child, where's the ADHD? Is it sitting inside of them somewhere? Um,
Mm.
and if we say the child with ADHD, I'm thinking, where's the ADHD? Has he got it in his pocket? Is he got it in his rucksack? It too closely identifies the identity of the child, which to me is sacred, with this disorder. ADHD, after all, has three negatives in it: deficit hyperactivity disorder. So do you really need three negatives closely associated with your identity? So what
Mm.
I say is the child who is diagnosed with ADHD, because that happened. That was a
Mm.
real social act that occurred. A doctor, a medical doctor, did in fact assign a diagnosis of ADHD to this child. So I can say it without concern, and I've created an insulation between the identity of the child and the label itself. And to me, this may sound academic, but it's not. From the child's point of view, the words that we use to describe kids have a tremendous impact on them,
Mm.
and for good or for ill. And, unfortunately, what happens is a lot of times the child will be having his time doing the things he loves to do, and then he'll start hearing the adults whispering, "Psst, psst,
Mm.
there's something wrong, there's something
Yeah.
wrong." And that's what they're hearing. The only part they're hearing is there's something wrong. There's something wrong with Adam. There's something wrong with Adam. And then, things start happening. Like, we're going to take you to this man, and he's going to sit you across the table from him, and he's going to ask you some questions. Well, what's this for?
Yeah.
And
It's scary. It's a
it's
scary
scary,
environment, right? Yeah.
and sometimes the people try to come up with nifty ways of um, sugarcoating, the medicine. Like we'll say, well, your ADHD is like a car, and your engine runs too fast, and we're just going to take some car medicine and pour it in the engine so that it runs better. And we try to sugarcoat it in that way. And I don't know what that sounds like to a child, but to me, uh, it compares my mind to a machine, and that can break down.
Yep.
And
Yep.
I don't want that kind of image running through my mind. I'd much
No.
rather somebody say, okay, your brain is like a rainforest, and the rainforest has all kinds of diversity, of all kinds of lushness, and so forth and so on. And you can really grow your brain forest as you learn, and as you master new things, and as you get involved with your interests. I mean, that's a whole different way of approaching things. It's not saying, by the way, bud, you have a defective brain, and here's the medicine that you have to take, like you're sick. Isn't that what kids think? If I have to take a drug, I must be sick.
Yeah, and it impacts them emotionally, socially, their
Exactly.
self-esteem, and I think that, yeah, I think you're absolutely spot on. I think that's why I think this work that you're doing is so important to kind of get out there, that research as well. Because you did mention, one research-backed strategy is being more in nature, and I know you've
Yes.
got like lots more in your book. But what are like 2 to 3 sort of research-backed or science-backed strategies without the drugs that can help parents and their children diagnosed with ADHD, cope better?
Right. Well, I think one that I like is martial arts training, particularly for
Oh,
boys,
sounds great.
because
Yeah.
martial arts training teaches respect for one's opponent. It teaches focus, which is exactly what a lot of kids diagnosed with ADHD need. And it's something that boys especially esteem. And so they want to be like that. They learn these skills of inner control. I mean, isn't that what we're all about? So instead of a drug controlling them, they're controlling their own selves in this discipline that is very, focused and directed toward helping one attain a sense of peace. And a related one is mindfulness meditation, which
Mm.
is a form of meditation where you just kind of sit and watch your breathing. And if things start to flow through your mind. You just notice what they are and then go back to your breathing. And then if they continue to float around, you just notice them again and you go back to your breathing. And you just do that the whole time you're doing it. I've been doing it for 30 years. The research on it is pretty powerful. And the research for ADHD, for depression, for several conditions. And to me, it's like the wonder drug of the 2020s, because it can, it's essentially, it is a drug because we're using our mind to produce more neurotransmitters that we need in order to feel a sense of calmness and focus. So that's
Beautiful.
another one.
Yeah.
And
I know it's interesting you say that actually. I was coaching someone a few years ago. He's got ADHD, but I didn't really know much about ADHD then. We were just doing other coaching through
right.
his career and that sort of stuff. But for some reason, I had this idea that I'd like to take him to a Buddhist temple. So I ended up taking him to a Buddhist temple in West London,
Oh, cool.
because they do meditation sessions and you sit on the floor and listen to it. And I had my one eye open. I wasn't really meditating. I had one eye open just to see if he was okay. And he actually got through the 45-minute session really well, to be fair. And I think he carried that on. And I'm so happy that you said
That's
that.
terrific.
It
Yeah.
sounds like I was doing the right thing.
And it doesn't even need to be a religious thing. In fact, the way it's taught in the U.S., it's taught as a method of stress reduction.
Yes.
And, some people are attracted to the religious underpinnings, the Buddhist underpinnings, and other people try other meditative approaches like transcendental meditation. There are many kinds of meditation. Some kind of inner practice. This is early on when I was doing the first version of my book. I just kind of marveled at the fact the whole ADHD field said nothing about meditation. Meditation is a many thousands-year-old practice to help people with their attention and their focus. And they didn't know anything about it. And that struck me as pathetic. They've come, I've said a lot of negative things. I should say the ADHD field has come along. At least some of the individuals have. People like Ned Hallowell, for example, has been, part of the let's take a holistic approach and let's not get too hung up on the ADHD label. So that's good. A magazine is being published in the U.S. called Attitude, Additude, which has lots of great strategies. They've included some of the strategies from my book. So I think there's a lot more happening in the sort of the self-help area of ADHD than there is in the special education programs in the public schools. And the part of the problem is the public schools are themselves,
Burden.
saddled. They're saddled
Yeah.
by lots of legal regulations. They're saddled with having to get their kids to perform on tests, and to do that they feel they have to use the traditional test taking, test preparing methods. So, and then they see the special ed kids as the ones who are holding down everybody else's grade point average and everybody else's test scores. So it just makes it hard for them to go into a more, what I'd call a freer way of approaching educating kids who learn differently.
Yeah. I mean, if with mindfulness, I think it's a really crucial strategy, just generally for everyone, right, to participate in it and do just to kind of do
Yeah.
that inner work. I think it's hard enough for an adult to do it day to day, as well. But how do you encourage a child to start this practice though? Like, what can parents do to help their child start the practice of mindful meditation or mindfulness?
Well, I think you start small. You don't expect your child to sit for 20 or 30 minutes.
No.
Sometimes what I love is using metaphors. And when I took my course in the 80s from a man named Jack Kornfield, he had this great metaphor. He said, think about it like puppy training. And I think kids would appreciate this. It's like you want to train the puppy, so you put him on his pad, and then he wanders off. So then all you do is you take him and you pick him up and put him back on his pad. And then he wanders off again. and you pick him up and you put him back on his pad. And that's what we're doing with our mind. We're,
Mm.
wandering away, and then we take ourselves and put it back on our breathing, focus on our breathing. It wanders away and we put it back on our breathing. And there are a few other metaphors like that. Some kindergarten programs, and there's a wonderful program at the University of Wisconsin, have taken little stuffed animals, and they have the kids lie down on their backs, and they put the stuffed animal on their stomach.
Mm.
And so they can look at it rise up and down and up and down.
Mm. Great.
Which
That's
just
a good
it
idea.
just reminds me too. Last night I saw the movie My Neighbor Totoro. Have you ever seen
Mm.
that?
No, I've never seen it, no.
Oh, I think it's the greatest animation movie ever made
Oh,
by
I've got it to my list now.
a Japanese director, Hayao Miyazaki. And the Totoro is this incredibly furry, wonderfully delightful beast, and he's huge. And the kids find him and crawl up on his belly, and you can just see his respiration's going up and down, and it just feels so comfortable. That's actually a good movie for introducing kids to mindfulness
That's
meditation.
a great idea. I'm going to
Yeah,
suggest that as well.
oh,
That's on my list to watch, I think, definitely.
definitely. It's beautiful, beautiful.
Um, that's such wonderful advice, and I love that it's just baby steps, isn't it? Really, to kind of
Yes.
really kind of encourage that mindfulness as well.
Yeah, start with
Um,
2 minutes or 3 minutes.
Exactly, exactly. So we spoke about being in nature. We spoke about mindfulness, martial arts training. Is there anything else that parents could try and do?
There's a lot of things. I mean, we were talking earlier about food and
Yes,
the fact that
yes.
using ultra processed foods are not helpful for our brains. And
Mm,
that if we use a better diet, in fact, the best diet, according to dietitians these days, is the Mediterranean diet, a
mm,
diet that's high in whole grains, legumes, seeds, nuts, fish on a couple times a week, lean meats occasionally, extra virgin olive oil for everything. I practically drink it out of the bottle.
Me too. I'm just like spreading all over everything.
Yeah, I do. It's great. Gee, I can do this with oil. It's incredible. And I discovered this when I went to Greece when I was 19 and I was doing my gap year, I guess, wandering around, and I just found the food delightful. And so, a diet that approaches that kind of diet is seen to reduce the symptoms of ADHD. So another thing is sunshine. Being out in
Mm,
nature, getting enough sunshine. If you look at a map of the United States and see where most of the sunshine is, it's in the southwest, where California and Arizona and New Mexico and Nevada and those states are. Then you look at a map of the incidence of ADHD. The places with the lowest incidence of ADHD are the places with the most sunshine. So getting your kid out,
amazing.
using sunblocker, of course, but getting them out. One kid said to this individual who coined the phrase nature deficit disorder, he said, I like to play inside because that's where the electrical sockets are. Plug in his video games. And you mentioned media, and I want to emphasize that again too, because that's another thing that parents can do something about. Reduce the amount of media in all forms, from social networks to iPhones to TV and movies and everything. Because the average teenager spends 7 hours a day on screens. And that
Mm,
doesn't even include the time he's using computers at school. Can you believe that?
yeah,
seven
yeah,
hours
yeah.
plus. And
Nuts.
this does something. I've got a whole chapter on it in the myth of the ADHD child. This dysregulates their dopamine. Dopamine is a neurotransmitter in our brain that anticipates rewards. It's like the phone's ringing. Oh, I wonder who's that's going to be. Maybe it'll be, somebody offering me $1 million as, a part of some publicity campaign. And that's what, of course, media does, social networking, scrolling, scrolling, scrolling. Did I get a like? Scrolling, scrolling.
Yep.
Oh, they got more likes than I have, scrolling, scrolling. And each time we do that, it triggers a dopaminergic reaction in our brain.
Mm,
And so we're kind of dopamine addicts. And it's no coincidence that one of the major areas of concern with kids who are diagnosed with ADHD is that they have dysregulation in the dopaminergic system, particularly large areas of the frontal lobes, which again are where the executive functions are, and another area of concern with kids who are diagnosed with ADHD. So less media
mm,
diets, would be
mm.
critical. The funny thing is, parents don't have to do very much. Just give their kids what all kids got in the 1950s
And the 60s and the
and
70s
the
and the
70s.
80s.
Yeah, exactly, exactly. And look what the ADHD rates were back then.
Yeah, indeed, and that's what's the alarming thing about it, like how much it's rising and being diagnosed. But I think that your work is incredible. It's insightful, and I think parents, if you're a parent with a child who's been diagnosed with ADHD, please do go out and explore Thomas's books because I think it'd really help. Thomas, it's been so insightful speaking to you today. How can people connect with you outside of this or read more about what you're doing?
Sure. Well, I've got a website. It's called, it's www.institute, the number 4 learning.com. Institute, the number 4 learning.com. And so that's a good place to start. And you could also, all my books are available there. I've written 20 books. I've written books that are translated in 30 languages. So you can
Incredible.
go actually to my site and find the contacts if you want to order it in a different language. I keep a blog regularly, and you can sign up for my blog on my website. And lately, right now, I'm doing a video series on the myth of the ADHD child. So look for that. And I'm doing my last video today of the 12. And that's a good place. You could follow me on Twitter. I'm not gonna call it that other thing. You can follow me on Twitter at Dr. Dr. underspace Armstrong, at
Wonderful.
Dr. underscore Armstrong. And so that's another way of kind of following what I've been doing. And there's a conference coming up in October at Stanford University. It's going to be a virtual conference called a Neurodiversity Summit, where many people will be speaking, some from the Stanford Medical School and some from places around the world, actually. And I'm going to be one of the keynoters. It's only $20 for 3 days of virtual information on neurodiversity, on all aspects, on the work aspects, the educational aspects, the mental health aspects. So I would encourage people to sign up for that.
I'm definitely
And
signing up myself for the conference. That sounds amazing. That's going to
yeah,
really, yeah, that's incredible. I mean, like, where else can you get that sort of, and it's virtual as well, right? So where else can you
it's
get that
virtual.
more
Exactly.
information?
Right.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Yeah, very good.
And then one
So
more
yeah,
thing.
yes.
One more thing. Wait a minute. One more thing. I'll be back in a second. I just wrote a novel called Childless,
Amazing. Very
and
good.
it goes along with everything we've been talking about. It's about a childless child psychologist who tries to foil a government plot to remove childhood from the human genome. They're going to diagnose childhood, the whole of childhood from birth to puberty, as a medical disorder, and then they're going to use genetic engineering to remove it from the genome so that people will be born and pop into life. First, they'll be a baby for a few seconds, and then they'll literally pop into an adult.
That's
And so
terrifying.
in the book, in the book, I call them popcorn adults. So,
I love that. I love that. I'm going to
yeah.
read that. That sounds amazing.
Oh, thank you. Yeah. So anyway, I had to say that.
Congratulations on writing your novel. That's fantastic.
Thank you. It took me.
Where'd you get all this time? Like, where'd you get all this time to write all these books, these 20 books?
I had to do well. A lot of the books I was just totally. I would sit down and say, okay, I've signed a contract. The contract says it's got to be done by such and such a date, and then I
Got
would work
timelines.
against the deadline. I'm good at working with deadlines.
Very good. Very
The
good.
novel was different. The novel took me 30 years to write.
Right.
And I would have to, take time that I could find. I was in the Middle East once in Abu Dhabi, and I had 5 weeks. I was only working on the weekends, and so I had five weekday days to write. And so I would just sneak it in. I'd write it on airplanes. I'd write it in the backyard, wherever. And finally, about 2 years ago, I finished it, and there it is.
Well, I'm looking forward to reading it. It sounds amazing and fascinating as well.
I hope you
Um,
enjoy it.
no, thank you. And it's been a fascinating, wonderful conversation with you, Thomas, as well. Thank you so much for being part of the Power of the New podcast. It's been great to speak to you today.
Thank you, Mamta. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.
Take care.
All right.